Number 1. Joel and Michael Stovall. On the evening of September 28, 2001, dispatch received a call about gunfire in Penrose, Colorado, a small community in Fremont County. A neighbor reported that someone had shot and killed a dog. It was the kind of call that typically resulted in a citation, maybe an arrest for reckless endangerment, nothing more. Deputy Jason Schwartz of the Fremont County Sheriff's Department responded to the scene at approximately 9 o'clock that night. What he encountered would set in motion one of the most violent law enforcement confrontations in Colorado history. When Schwartz arrived at the residence, he found 24-year-old Joel Stovall, who admitted to shooting the neighbor's dog 5 times. The deputy placed Joel under arrest for reckless endangerment and began the process of transporting him to the county jail. But the situation quickly escalated. Members of the Stovall family confronted Deputy Schwartz during the arrest, and Joel's identical twin brother, Michael, became increasingly agitated and threatening. Schwartz called for backup. When another deputy arrived, Michael Stovall was also arrested for threatening an officer and causing a disturbance. Both brothers were placed in the back seat of Deputy Schwartz's patrol car for transport to the jail in Canyon City. This is where a critical and ultimately fatal error occurred. Joel Stovall was searched before being placed in the vehicle. His brother, Michael, was not. According to law enforcement protocols, both suspects should have been thoroughly searched. But in the commotion of the confrontation and the need to quickly secure the scene, Michael Stovall was placed in the back of the patrol car without being frisked. He was carrying 2 handguns, a .32 caliber semi-automatic and a 9mm semi-automatic, concealed in his pants. He also had a homemade handcuff key in his pocket. As the patrol car traveled along the road, Michael Stovall removed the homemade handcuff key from his pocket and freed himself from the restraints. According to Joel Stovall's later testimony to authorities, Michael asked Deputy Schwartz to let them go, telling him there would be consequences if he refused. Schwartz noticed what was happening and immediately called the situation in to dispatch. Before he could react further, Michael Stovall pulled the 9mm handgun from his pants and fired through a gap in the protective barrier that separated the back seat from the front. He shot Deputy Schwartz 4 times in the back of the head. Joel Stovall later told investigators, "I'm pretty sure it took him out immediately." The patrol car veered off the road and crashed into a ditch beneath the Colorado Highway 115 overpass on US Highway 50. The brothers freed themselves from the vehicle and dragged Deputy Schwartz's body out onto the ground. Even though the deputy had already been shot 4 times in the head and was almost certainly dead, the Stovall brothers stood over him and fired additional rounds into his body. In total, Deputy Jason Schwartz was shot 16 times. Sheriff Jim Biker later described the murder to the Canyon City Daily Record, saying, "Jason's murder was brutal. They dragged him out in front of his car and filled him with holes. The brothers then fled on foot. They knew exactly where they were going. The Stovall twins had been renting a mobile home in Florence, approximately 5 miles from the crash site. As they made their way through the dark, law enforcement began responding to the scene of Deputy Schwartz's murder. Officers found the abandoned patrol car, the deputy's body, and no sign of the suspects. A manhunt was immediately launched, but the brothers had a significant head start. Joel and Michael Stovall reached their trailer and went inside. What they had stored there revealed the extent of their preparation and their mindset. The residence contained what investigators later described as a virtual armory. The twins retrieved an AK-47 rifle, an SKS rifle, bulletproof vests, and ballistic helmets. They loaded weapons and ammunition into a bag. They had been stockpiling this equipment for some time, and neighbors would later describe the brothers as loners who wore camouflage clothing and had an obsessive interest in firearms. One neighbor said they always seemed to be preparing for war. While the Stovall brothers were arming themselves, the Florence Police Department dispatched 2 officers to check the trailer. Corporal Toby Bethel and Officer Eric Baker arrived at the location and began their approach. As Corporal Bethel and Officer Baker approached the trailer, the Stovall brothers opened fire with the AK-47. Bethel was hit 4 times. 2 rounds struck near his spine. 1 hit his shoulder and 1 hit his bicep. He heard a pop, then felt what he described as a sharp burn. He recalls thinking, "Oh no, they got us, didn't they?" His patrol car crashed into a building and then into a tree. Bethel slipped in and out of consciousness, trapped in the vehicle. The Stovall brothers approached the wrecked car to check if he was still alive. Fortunately for Bethel, they moved on. Officer Baker sustained minor injuries and was treated and released from the hospital. Corporal Toby Bethel survived the ambush, but the bullet wounds near his spine left him permanently paralyzed from the waist down. He has been confined to a wheelchair for more than 20 years. After the ambush, the Stovall brothers stole a pickup truck from a neighbor and drove west on Colorado Highway 115 toward Canyon City. They had already murdered one deputy and critically wounded a police officer. Now they were heavily armed, wearing body armor, and fleeing in a stolen vehicle. Law enforcement agencies across Fremont County mobilized every available resource. What followed was a 60-mile high-speed chase and running gun battle that would leave 17 law enforcement officers under fire and multiple agencies scrambling to coordinate a response. The brothers drove into Canyon City, where they exchanged gunfire with Canyon City police officers. They continued onto US Highway 50, a winding mountain road that tracks the Arkansas River through rugged terrain. Patrol cars pursued them. The Stovall twins fired at officers from the bed of the pickup truck. They also threw objects from the vehicle to disable their pursuers. At one point, they threw a typewriter from the back of the truck, striking and disabling the vehicle driven by Sheriff Ivan Middlemiss. The sheriff's car was taken out of commission, and the chase continued. The brothers set up multiple ambush positions along the route. They would stop, take cover, and open fire on approaching officers, then get back in the truck and continue driving. One of these ambushes injured another officer. Florence Police Chief Mike Engel caught up with the truck at one point during the pursuit and leaned over in his seat just before bullets struck his vehicle. One round hit him in the arm, but he survived. The Stovalls also fired a shotgun they had taken from Deputy Schwartz's patrol car, wounding another officer. As they raced through the county, the twins drove over road spikes deployed by officers in the town of Swissvale. But they kept going. They continued west toward Salida, nearly 40 miles from Florence, but encountered a roadblock set up by law enforcement just east of the town. The brothers turned around and drove back approximately half a mile before abandoning the truck. They fled on foot into the Methodist Mountains, a rugged and heavily forested area that made tracking them extremely difficult. By this point, law enforcement agencies from across the Front Range were responding. SWAT teams, tactical units, and a helicopter from Colorado Springs were deployed. Virtually every law enforcement officer with a gun in the region was involved in the search. The manhunt continued through the night and into the next day. The Stovall brothers had positioned themselves in the mountains above the abandoned truck and set up an ambush, waiting for officers to approach. They stayed hidden for hours. A helicopter conducted aerial sweeps of the area. Officers searched the dense forest on foot, knowing the brothers were armed with assault rifles and body armor. Approximately 24 hours after the initial murder of Deputy Schwartz, the Stovall brothers were spotted returning to the location where they had abandoned the truck. 2 rangers from the State Parks Department and 1 officer from the Division of Wildlife were guarding the vehicle. When the brothers approached, the officers ordered them to surrender. Joel and Michael Stovall complied without resistance. The rampage was over. 1 law enforcement officer was dead, 1 was permanently paralyzed, and 3 others were wounded. 17 officers in total had been shot at during the 60-mile pursuit. The Stovall brothers made their first court appearance in October of 2001 before District Court Judge John Anderson. They were ordered held without bail. Judge Anderson made the decision to house them in a maximum security facility in El Paso County rather than in Fremont County. He explained that he was concerned about how they would be treated in the local jail, given the raw emotions in the community following the murder of Deputy Schwartz and the shooting of multiple officers. During the hearing, the twins' father, Rob Stovall, sat stone-faced in the back of the courtroom. Afterward, his voice breaking, he told reporters that he believed his sons had felt their lives were threatened when they shot Deputy Schwartz. On November 2, 2001, charges were formally filed against Joel and Michael Stovall. On the same day, both brothers entered into a plea agreement. They were each charged with 1 count of first-degree murder, 18 counts of attempted first-degree murder, and 1 count of aggravated robbery. They pleaded guilty to all charges. In their sentencing, Joel and Michael Stovall were each given life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. plus 896 years. The sentence was structured to ensure they would never be released. The brothers were separated and placed in different Colorado prisons under 23-hour lockdown conditions. As of 2025, Michael Stovall is incarcerated at Sterling Correctional Facility, and Joel Stovall is housed at Lyman Correctional Facility. Their Department of Corrections sentence discharge date is listed as December 31st, 9998, which is effectively a designation meaning they will never be released. Number 2. Daniel and David DeWild. On the afternoon of July 24, 2003, 30-year-old Heather DeWild drove to a house on Garrison Street in Edgewater, Colorado, with her 2 children in the back seat. Jacob was 5 years old. Hannah was 3. Heather needed her estranged husband to sign a check that had both of their names on it, and she was there to pick up health insurance cards for the children. The divorce was a week away from being finalized. Heather had been living with her parents during the separation, and a judge had awarded her temporary custody. Daniel DeWild, her husband of 6 years, had been ordered to pay child support. According to people who knew him, Daniel was furious about the arrangement. He believed the financial obligation would cost him his home, and he told neighbors that Heather was ruining his life. Heather brought the children with her that day because she did not want to be alone with Daniel. The house belonged to him, but he was not the only one living there. His identical twin brother, David DeWild, had moved in several months earlier, along with David's girlfriend, Roseanne Knowles. David had offered to help Daniel cover the bills after the divorce proceedings began. The twins had always been inseparable. Born 90 seconds apart, they worked together as mechanics for the Regional Transportation District in Denver. When Heather arrived at the house that afternoon, she went inside with Jacob and Hannah. The children turned on the TV in the living room while Heather spoke with Daniel. At some point during the visit, Daniel told Heather he had something to show her in the garage. She followed him outside. David DeWild was already in the garage when they walked in. According to the account David would later provide to investigators, Heather asked Daniel what he wanted to show her. Daniel closed the door behind them, grabbed her by both shoulders, and threw her down hard onto the floor. Heather looked at David from where she had fallen. David said she did not see what was coming. Daniel struck her in the head with a rubber mallet. He placed a noose around her neck that had been attached to a pulley system rigged to the garage rafters. He used the pulley to lift her body off the ground. While she hung from the wooden beam, Daniel tied her hands in front of her to make it appear as though she had been involved in a sex act gone wrong. He wrapped her body in plastic trash bags and secured them with duct tape. He bound rope to her neck and wrists. The children were still watching TV in the next room. Daniel and David DeWild had been planning this for months. According to David's later testimony, Daniel began talking about killing Heather in April of 2003, shortly after the temporary divorce orders were issued. The twins studied forensic crime shows on TV, programs like CSI and 48 Hours, to learn how to avoid leaving evidence. They purchased new disposable razors to cut the rope because they had seen on TV that new razors could not be traced. They wore long sleeves and double gloves to prevent their hair, fibers, or DNA from ending up on the body. They set up the garage in advance, laying out duct tape and rope, attaching the noose to the pulley system. The planning was meticulous. The execution was brutal. And for nearly a decade, it appeared as though they might get away with it. After killing Heather, the twins disposed of her body in a shallow grave in Clear Creek Canyon, alongside westbound Highway 6, approximately 15 miles outside of Denver. They drove her Nissan Sentra to an apartment complex in Wheat Ridge and abandoned it there. The car was wiped clean. Even Heather's own fingerprints, which would have been expected on the steering wheel, were missing. One of the twins drove the car to the disposal site, while the other followed in a separate vehicle to bring the driver back. The original theory, developed by investigators, was that a third person, likely Roseanne, had stayed at the house to watch the children during the disposal. According to Daniel's story, Heather had left Jacob and Hannah with him to go shopping and never returned. He reported her missing the following day. Heather's father was a veteran officer with the Denver Police Department. His name was David Springer, and when his daughter did not come home that evening, he knew immediately that something was wrong. Heather would not have left her children with Daniel during an unscheduled visit. Springer reported her missing on July 25, 2003. Detective Ron Kreider was assigned to the case. Kreider learned that the divorce between Heather and Daniel had been contentious, particularly regarding custody and child support. Daniel was upset that Heather had been awarded temporary custody, and he was angry about the financial implications. When Kreider went to the house on Garrison Street to speak with Daniel, the conversation was brief. Daniel mentioned almost immediately that he had hired an attorney, which Kreider found unusual given that his wife had only just gone missing. When David DeWild pulled into the driveway while Kreider was still there, Daniel physically moved toward his brother and told him not to speak to the police. He instructed David to go inside the house. Kreider left believing that he was no longer dealing with a missing person case. He believed he was dealing with a murder. Police obtained a search warrant for the house, but by the time they executed it, Heather had been missing for 6 days. Inside, investigators found no murder weapon, no blood, and no sign that Heather had been killed there. There was no physical evidence linking Daniel or David to her disappearance. But investigators did learn something that caught their attention. David DeWild, a professional mechanic, had taken his Chevrolet Suburban to a repair shop 15 miles away shortly after Heather went missing. Kreider found that detail significant. Why would a mechanic, whose twin brother was also a mechanic, take his vehicle 15 miles away for repairs? Police requested permission to examine the Suburban. A cadaver dog was brought in to inspect the vehicle, and the dog alerted to the scent of decomposition. But when forensic technicians processed the interior, they found no DNA, no blood, and no physical evidence connecting the vehicle to Heather's disappearance. On August 4, 2003, a resident at an apartment complex in Wheat Ridge reported seeing Heather's Nissan Sentra in the parking lot. Police processed the vehicle and found it completely clean. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, and no forensic evidence of any kind. Then, on September 4, 2003, a worker with the Colorado Department of Transportation discovered a body in a shallow grave near Highway 6 in Clear Creek Canyon. The body was wrapped in plastic trash bags secured with duct tape. The victim's face was covered with tape. Her hands were tied in front of her, and there was a ligature around her neck. She was wearing the same clothes Heather had been wearing the day she disappeared. The body was severely decomposed. The medical examiner was unable to determine the exact cause of death due to the condition of the remains. The trash bags used to wrap the body matched the general class characteristics of bags taken from the DeWild home, but that was not enough to prove who had killed her. There was no DNA evidence. There were no fingerprints. The rope and plastic could not be traced. Even if investigators had found blood evidence from either Daniel or David, they would have faced an extraordinary problem. The twins were identical. Their DNA was the same. There would have been no way to prove which brother had committed the crime based on genetic evidence alone. In the weeks following the discovery of Heather's body, investigators focused on Daniel and David, but they did not have enough evidence to make an arrest. Daniel was charged with forgery for allegedly writing Heather's name on checks from 1999, valued at more than $16,000, but those charges were dropped in November of 2004. In 2005, Heather's family approached the newly elected district attorney for Jefferson County, a man named Scott Story. They asked him to reopen the investigation. Story promised them that before he left office, he would resolve the case. In 2009, 6 years after Heather was murdered, Story assigned senior investigator Russ Boatwright to work on the case full-time. Boatwright began methodically reviewing the evidence. He revisited the timeline of events and looked for inconsistencies in the statements provided by Daniel and David. And then, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Advances in cell phone technology allowed investigators to retroactively analyze the location data from phones used on the day Heather disappeared. The phone records showed that there had been 14 calls between Daniel, David, and Roseanne during a 4-hour period around the time of Heather's disappearance. More importantly, investigators were able to determine where those calls had been made. David DeWild's cell phone had pinged off a tower near the apartment complex in Wheat Ridge where Heather's car was found. The call had been placed to Daniel. The evidence suggested that David had been the one to drive Heather's car to the disposal site and that Daniel had followed to pick him up. It was the first concrete piece of evidence linking the twins to the disposal of the body and the car. Boatwright and his team continued building the case piece by piece. On December 14, 2011, more than 8 years after Heather was killed, Daniel DeWild, David DeWild, and Roseanne DeWild were arrested within 45 minutes of each other. All three were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The indictment alleged that the three suspects had subdued Heather, removed her from the home, and disposed of her body and her car. It stated that a code of silence had been put in place. Investigators believed that it would have required all three people to carry out the crime. One person to drive Heather's car, one person to follow and retrieve the driver, and one person to stay behind and watch the children. For months, all three defendants refused to cooperate with investigators. But in August of 2012, David DeWilde made a decision that would change the course of the case. He agreed to testify against his twin brother in exchange for a plea deal. David pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit second-degree murder. As part of the agreement, he provided investigators with a detailed account of how Heather had been killed. He participated in a 28-minute video reenactment of the murder, walking investigators through every step of what had happened in the garage that day. He described how Daniel had prepared the garage in advance, how he had lured Heather outside, how he had thrown her to the ground and struck her with the mallet, and how he had used the pulley system to hang her body while wrapping it for disposal. In October of 2012, prosecutors dropped the charges against Roseanne DeWilde. The district attorney's office released a statement saying that her knowledge of events was less than previously indicated and that there was no reasonable likelihood of conviction at trial. Daniel DeWilde's trial began in November of 2012. The prosecution's case relied heavily on David's testimony. Chief Deputy District Attorney Robert Weiner told the jury that David had given them something better than DNA. The jury deliberated for more than a day. On November 19, 2012, they returned a split verdict. They found Daniel DeWilde guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and accessory to murder, but they were deadlocked on the charge of first-degree murder itself. The jury could not unanimously agree that Daniel was the twin who had actually killed Heather. Some jurors believed the evidence pointed to David. Others believed Daniel was guilty. On December 20, 2012, Daniel DeWilde accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for waiving his right to appeal and agreeing to provide a full account of the crime. He also waived his right to challenge the conspiracy conviction. On January 24, 2013, David DeWilde was sentenced to 12 years in prison for conspiracy to commit second-degree murder. It was the maximum sentence allowed under the terms of his plea agreement. Judge Munch sentenced Daniel DeWilde to 74 years in prison, just 1 year short of what the prosecution had requested. Daniel will not be eligible for parole until after he has served the full sentence. Number 3. Edwin and Edward Berndt. On the afternoon of April 11, 2011, a Houston Police Department patrol officer arrived at a single-family home in the 8400 block of Glenscott Street in southeast Houston, near Hobby Airport. The officer was responding to a welfare check. A neighbor had called to report that she had not seen Sybil Berndt, an 89-year-old woman who lived at the address, since January. The neighbor said she had left multiple phone messages for Sybil over the past weeks, but none had been returned. She had heard from someone that the elderly woman had gone to Florida, but she had seen Sybil's adult sons, Edward and Edwin, outside in the yard the previous week, and something about the situation did not sit right with her. She called Adult Protective Services, and they instructed her to request a welfare check with the police. When the officer knocked on the front door at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, she saw a face appear in the window. It was Edwin Berndt, one of Sybil's 48-year-old twin sons. He looked out at the officer, but did not open the door. The officer waited. A few moments later, Edwin exited the house through a side door. He told the officer that everyone inside was fine and that there was no need for the police to be there. The officer said she needed to see his mother. Edwin hesitated, then allowed the officer to enter through the side door. The moment the officer stepped inside, she was hit with an overwhelming smell. The house was in what she would later describe in court documents as deplorable condition. The air was thick with the stench of rotting flesh. Flies covered the curtains. The officer moved through the side entrance into the front foyer, and there, lying face down on the floor, was the body of Sybil Berndt. She was wearing a nightgown that had been pulled up just under her arms. Her body was in an advanced state of decomposition, and insects were crawling all over it. The officer immediately called for backup and homicide detectives. When Houston Police Department Homicide Division Sergeant R. Torres and Senior Police Officer J. Johnston arrived at the scene, they found Edwin and his identical twin brother, Edward, both wearing matching flannel pajama bottoms. The brothers had bushy, unkempt beards and wild hair. They looked nothing like the clean-cut, well-groomed men that neighbors had been accustomed to seeing for years. The condition of the house was described by investigators as putrid. The air conditioning had been turned off, and the stagnant heat of a Houston home in spring had accelerated the decomposition of Sybil Burnt's body. Sergeant Torres, a seasoned investigator, said later that a person would not normally be able to withstand that smell for more than 1 minute, maybe 2 at the most, without heaving their insides out. Officer Johnston, who had been a police officer for 17 years, said it was the first time he had dealt with anything like it. The twins were taken into custody and questioned. What they told investigators was both shocking and difficult to comprehend. They said they had been watching the BCS National Championship college football game on the evening of January 10th, 2011, when their mother came into the living room. She was appearing delusional, they said, ranting and raving that someone was going to break into the house and steal their piano. At some point during this episode, Sybil fell to the floor in the front foyer. She did not get back up. The brothers said that after she fell, they decided not to call for medical help because they did not have money for medical treatment. They left her lying on the floor. Edwin told investigators that his mother was conscious and able to speak for about a day after she fell. He said she did not ask them for help. They did not give her any food or water. Edwin said he remembered that his mother died on January 13th because it was 1 day after her 89th birthday. After she died, the brothers said, they did not move her body. They did not call the police. They said they could not afford to bury her, and they did not want to go to jail. For the next 3 months, from mid-January until early April, Edward and Edwin Burnt continued to live in the house with their mother's decomposing corpse lying on the floor. They told investigators they never left the house during that time. They survived on a diet of potato chips, candy, and popcorn. Empty popcorn bags were scattered throughout the home. The brothers had not bathed, shaved, or cut their hair in 3 months. When they walked through the living room or foyer, they simply stepped over their mother's body. Sergeant Torres said later that they just stepped over her all day, every day. The investigators found bank statements in the house showing that Sybil Burnt had $700,000 in her accounts. The family also owned ranch property that they rented out, which provided regular income. Neither Edward nor Edwin had held a job for several years. The brothers' claim that they could not afford medical treatment or a funeral was directly contradicted by the financial evidence. This raised immediate questions. Had the twins been motivated by financial gain? Had they allowed their mother to die so they could inherit her money? On April 12, 2011, both Edward Larry Burnt and Edwin Christian Burnt were formally charged with felony murder in the 339th State District Court of Harris County, Texas. They were booked into the Harris County Jail. But as investigators dug deeper into the case, a more complicated and tragic picture began to emerge. Neighbors were interviewed, and they painted a portrait of 2 men who had always been quiet, docile, and completely dependent on their mother. Jim Scott, a 75-year-old neighbor who lived across the street, said he had occasionally seen the twins in the front yard, raking leaves and mowing the lawn. They never bothered anyone. They kept to themselves. He said he would have never expected something like this to happen because they seemed very docile. Another neighbor, Segundo Abrego III, who was 18 years old, said the brothers seemed harmless and always kept to themselves. A neighbor named Jeff Guillory, who lived a few doors down, said it was common knowledge in the area that the twins were mentally disabled. The twins' attorney, Robert Scardino, requested psychiatric evaluations for both Edward and Edwin. When the evaluations came back, they revealed a profound level of mental disability. Scardino explained that both brothers had been deprived of oxygen at birth, which had caused permanent brain damage. He said this oxygen deprivation was the source of their problems with being able to make decisions and live in society, to live a life with other people. One of the twins, Edward, had been diagnosed with a form of autism called Asperger's syndrome. The other twin, Edwin, was described by Scardino as so mentally disabled that he was not really functional. The attorney said that both men were incapable of feeling or expressing emotion. They spoke in one-word sentences and showed little emotion, if any. When Scardino spoke with them, they wore blank stares. Despite this, Sergeant Torres had noted that both men spoke clearly with a bit of a southern drawl and seemed fairly intelligent when questioned. This paradox was explained, at least in part, by their educational history. Both twins had graduated from high school. Edwin had attended Milby High School, and Edward had attended Lyndon B. Johnson High School, where he was in a program for gifted children. But intelligence and the ability to function independently are not the same thing. The twins could perform basic tasks. They could write checks. They could feed themselves. They could rake leaves and mow the lawn. But they could not make complex decisions. They could not manage their own care. They could not assess a medical emergency and take appropriate action. When investigators asked the twins why they had not tried to help their mother, their answer was chilling in its simplicity. They said she never asked them to. This response reflected the profound limitations in their cognitive and emotional processing. They could not infer from context that a person lying on the floor, unable to get up, needed help. They required direct, explicit instruction. Without that instruction, they did not act. Sergeant Torres said the twins did not seem to have any real remorse for their mother. He said he thought they were more concerned with what was going to happen to them. But this assessment may have been incomplete. The twins were not capable of expressing emotion in the way that most people do. Their lack of visible remorse did not necessarily mean they felt nothing. It meant they could not communicate what they felt, if they felt anything at all. Robert Scardino said the decision did not surprise him. He said the twins, who were deprived of oxygen at birth, were not capable of helping their mother. He said that if they had been indicted, they would almost certainly have been declared incompetent to stand trial. The grand jury had determined that the twins lacked the mental capacity to form criminal intent. Scardino described the case as unusual and tragic. He said it was hard to imagine living under the circumstances those two men had lived in with their dead mother for 3 months. The twins' cousin, Elvin Burnt, said he was relieved that they would not go to trial for murder. He acknowledged that what they did was not right, but he said they did not know what they were doing. After the charges were dismissed, a probate judge appointed family members to act as legal guardians for Edward and Edwin. The autopsy performed by the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences could not determine the cause of Sybil Burnt's death. The autopsy found that she had stress ulcers and heart disease, but the exact mechanism of death could not be established. The twins were not exonerated because what they did was acceptable. They were not indicted because they could not be held criminally responsible. The legal system recognized that Edward and Edwin Burnt were, in their own way, victims. They were victims of a birth injury that left them permanently disabled. Number 4. Keyshawn and Kenyatta Blake. On the evening of December 22, 2014, at approximately 6:30 p.m., Maria Elena Rivas was walking westbound on Adams Boulevard in South Los Angeles. She was 62 years old and worked as a seamstress. She had just finished her shift and taken the bus to the Ralph's supermarket at Vermont Avenue and Adams Boulevard, where she had purchased groceries for the upcoming Christmas holiday. The surveillance camera inside the store had captured her at the checkout counter. Her purse was clearly visible on her shoulder as she paid the cashier with cash from her wallet. She left the store and began walking the few blocks toward her home in the Adams Normandy neighborhood. It was rush hour. The street was busy. She was carrying her groceries and her purse. Minutes later, near the intersection of Adams Boulevard and Catalina Avenue, someone attacked her from behind. She was stabbed in the back. Her purse and wallet were stolen. Her groceries were left on the sidewalk. Paramedics arrived and transported her to a local hospital, but she did not survive. Maria Elena Rivas died from her stab wounds. It was 3 days before Christmas. Maria Elena Rivas had lived in South Los Angeles for most of her life. She was a longtime resident of the area, known to her family and friends as a woman who never disrespected anybody. She had never had children of her own, but she had raised her nephews. She dedicated her life to them. Her nephew, Misael Contreras, would later say that she had been like their right hand, like a mother to them. Her daily routine was simple and predictable. She took the bus from work, stopped at the grocery store, and walked home. On December 22nd, That routine cost her her life. When her body was found on the street, her purse was gone. Her wallet was gone. The cash she had used to pay for groceries just minutes earlier was gone. But the groceries were still there, abandoned on the sidewalk next to her. It was immediately clear to investigators that this was a robbery. What was not immediately clear was who had done it, or why they had felt the need to kill her. The Los Angeles Police Department's South Bureau Criminal Gang Homicide Division took over the investigation. Detectives canvassed the area. But despite the fact that the attack had occurred during rush hour on a busy street, no eyewitnesses came forward. No one had seen the attack. No one could describe the assailant. The case went cold almost immediately. Captain Peter Whittingham of the Los Angeles Police Department told reporters that there was absolutely no reason why such an innocent lady walking home to her family should be killed in the street. He said detectives had absolutely nothing to go on. On December 23rd, the day after the murder, the Los Angeles Police Department issued a public appeal for information. They released a statement describing the crime and asking anyone with knowledge to come forward. A makeshift memorial appeared at the site where Maria Elena Rivas had been attacked. Family members gathered there, handing out flyers, desperate for any information that could lead to an arrest. The Los Angeles Police Department announced a reward of $50,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible. On January 21, 2015, nearly a month after the murder, the LAPD publicly released the surveillance video from the Ralph's store showing Maria Elena Rivas checking out with her groceries. The video showed her purse on her shoulder. It showed her using cash to pay. It was a last-ditch effort to generate leads. Investigators hoped that someone who had been in the store that day, or someone who had seen her walking home, would recognize her and remember something useful. But still, nothing came. Then, on January 23, 2015, another robbery occurred. This time, it was in the mid-city area of Los Angeles, outside a liquor store. A woman was attacked and robbed. Unlike Maria Elena Rivas, this victim survived. She escaped with only minor injuries. The details of that robbery were not immediately made public, but investigators began to see a possible connection. The location was not far from the Adams-Normandy area. The method was similar. The victims were both women, attacked while alone. It was another purse snatching, another act of sudden violence in a public place. Detectives began to investigate whether the two crimes might be linked. 4 days later, on January 27, 2015, the Los Angeles Police Department announced that they had made arrests. Two 18-year-old twin brothers, Keyshawn Blake and Kenyatta Blake, were taken into custody. They were both from Los Angeles. And according to Detective Sal LaBarbera of the LAPD's Criminal Gang Homicide Division, they were not strangers to law enforcement. On January 28, 2015, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office filed formal charges against Keyshawn Blake and Kenyatta Blake. Each twin was charged with 1 count of murder and 2 counts of second-degree robbery. The murder charge related to the death of Maria Elena Rivas. The 2 robbery charges related to the attack on Maria Elena Rivas and the attack on the second victim outside the liquor store on January 23rd. The case against the Blake brothers was built on evidence that linked them to both the December 22nd murder and the January 23rd robbery. Investigators had surveillance footage, witness statements, and physical evidence that placed them in the area. They had established a pattern. Both crimes involved women walking alone. Both involved purse snatchings. Both involved sudden, violent attacks. The January 23rd victim had survived, and she was able to provide information to police. That information, combined with the evidence from the Ralph's surveillance video and the crime scene investigation, was enough to make the arrests. But despite the charges, the Blake brothers maintained their innocence. They were held without bail, and their cases moved slowly through the court system. On August 26, 2015, more than 7 months after their arrest, their arraignment was postponed until September. As the case proceeded, a significant issue emerged with one of the defendants. Keyshawn Blake's attorneys declared a doubt as to his competency to stand trial. Keyshawn Blake was referred to a state mental hospital for evaluation and treatment. His case was placed on hold. The specific nature of his mental health issues was not disclosed to the public, and as of the most recent available records, his case remains pending. He has never gone to trial. He has never been convicted. His twin brother, Kenyatta Blake, did not face the same issue. Kenyatta was deemed competent to stand trial, and his case moved forward. The prosecution's theory was that both brothers had participated in the crimes, though the exact role each twin played was not entirely clear. What was clear, according to prosecutors, was that Kenyatta Blake had been the one who fatally stabbed Maria Elena Rivas. The evidence supported this conclusion. On April 15, 2019, more than 4 years after Maria Elena Rivas was killed, Kenyatta Blake's case went to a jury. The trial was held in Los Angeles Superior Court. Judge Mark Arnold presided. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. They presented the surveillance video from the Ralph's store. On April 15, 2019, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury returned its verdict. Kenyatta Blake was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree robbery. The jury also found true the special allegation that the murder had occurred during a robbery and that Kenyatta Blake had personally used a knife. Kenyatta Blake was ordered, held without bail, pending sentencing. On May 2, 2019, Kenyatta Blake returned to court for sentencing. Judge Arnold had the discretion to impose a significant sentence. The conviction for first-degree murder with special circumstances meant that Kenyatta Blake was facing either life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. The prosecution had previously decided not to seek the death penalty, so the death penalty was off the table. That left life without parole as the maximum sentence. Judge Arnold sentenced Kenyatta Blake to 4 years plus life without the possibility of parole. This meant he would never walk free. He was 22 years old at the time of sentencing. He had been 18 when he killed Maria Elena Rivas. He would die in prison. Number 5. Roman and Ruslan Glukoy. Just after 5 o'clock in the morning, in the rain, Auburn police officers confronted a dark BMW tied to a string of thefts from unlocked cars. The driver did not comply. The car surged forward, swerved, and took off, accelerating onto Interstate 80. Inside the vehicle were twin brothers, Roman Andreevich Glukoy behind the wheel and Ruslan Glukoy in the passenger seat. What began as property crime in a quiet Placer County neighborhood had turned into a pursuit that would not end with the first crash. Earlier that morning, before dawn, Roman and Ruslan Glukoy had traveled to Auburn with a friend. According to the later appellate record, they moved through residential streets, stealing from unlocked vehicles. Residents noticed and called police. When officers located the BMW and attempted to detain the occupants, Roman, who was driving, sped off, initiating the pursuit. Speeds reached approximately 125 miles per hour as the BMW raced along Interstate 80. Around 5:12 a.m., near a Loomis exit, the chase ended when the BMW crashed violently. No one was killed in that first wreck. Both brothers survived, and despite the severity of the crash, neither was taken into custody at the scene. Instead of the incident ending there, the events of the morning continued. Roughly an hour later, law enforcement received a report that a Ford F-150 pickup truck had been stolen from a nearby neighborhood. Prosecutors would later allege that the truck was taken during a residential burglary to obtain the keys. Some news accounts describe the truck as taken from a driver. With Ruslan now driving the stolen pickup and Roman riding in the rear passenger seat, the twins encountered law enforcement again. Deputies attempted a traffic stop, but the truck fled. A second pursuit began, this time through areas with increasing traffic as the morning commute started. Speeds again climbed to approximately 120 miles per hour. Deputies described the driving as reckless and sustained, with the truck using emergency lanes and running red lights. The pursuit lasted roughly 8 to 9 minutes. As the truck approached Antelope Road, Ruslan drove through multiple red lights at speeds estimated between 80 and 90 miles per hour. At approximately 6:30 a.m., the pickup entered an intersection against a red signal and collided with a Kia. Inside the Kia were Jose Luis Barriga Tovar, age 35, and his 14-year-old daughter, Anahi Tovar. Both were killed in the impact. Their deaths were immediate, and the crash scene marked the end of the chase, but not the end of the Glukoy brothers' actions that morning. After the collision, neither twin rendered aid to the occupants of the Kia. Both fled the scene on foot. Roman was arrested shortly afterward in a nearby neighborhood. Ruslan ran farther, entering or attempting to enter nearby homes. At least one resident confronted him and threatened to get a gun. A K-9 unit was deployed, and Ruslan was located and taken into custody. Investigators pieced together the events of the morning using pursuit footage, witness accounts, and physical evidence from both crash scenes. Prosecutors charged both brothers with murder, along with additional offenses related to burglary, theft, and evading law enforcement. The legal theories differed between the twins, reflecting their roles and actions. Ruslan, as the driver of the stolen truck during the fatal collision, faced the most severe allegations. The prosecution argued that the deaths occurred during the commission of felony conduct, including burglary, making them first-degree felony murders with special circumstances. Roman, who was not driving the truck, but was present and involved in the events leading up to the crash, was charged under a different theory of liability. The case proceeded to trial in Placer County, with separate juries evaluating the evidence against each brother. On December 13, 2016, the verdicts were announced. Ruslan Glukoy was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree felony murder with special circumstance findings. Roman Andreevich Glukoy was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder. Some additional counts resulted in acquittals or deadlocked juries, but the core homicide conviction stood. Sentencing followed on January 20, 2017. Ruslan Glukoy received 2 terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Roman Glukoy was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life, totaling 30 years to life in prison. Today, both brothers remain incarcerated in California State Prison. Ruslan Glukoy is serving 2 sentences of life without the possibility of parole for the murders of Jose Luis Barriga Tovar and his 14-year-old daughter. Roman Andreevich Glukoy is serving a sentence of 30 years to life for 2 counts of second-degree murder. Number 6. Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead. Police were called to a 2-story home on Bridle Ridge Walk in Conyers, Georgia, after relatives became concerned that 34-year-old Jarmeka Yvonne Nikki Whitehead was not answering her phone. Inside the house, officers found Whitehead dead. She had suffered multiple injuries consistent with a violent assault involving a knife. The home showed signs of a struggle, but there was no indication of forced entry. From the outset, investigators focused on who had been inside the house with her. Nikki Whitehead was a working mother and a beautician. She lived in the home with her 16-year-old identical twin daughters, Jasmiyah Kanisha Whitehead and Tasmiyah Janisha Whitehead, known to friends and classmates as Jazz and Taz. The twins told police they had been home that day. They initially claimed their mother had been attacked during a burglary. As detectives processed the scene, they noted details that did not align with a random break-in. Items inside the house appeared disturbed, but there were no clear signs that an unknown intruder had entered. The focus narrowed to the people closest to the victim. Over the following days, investigators conducted interviews and reviewed physical evidence from inside the home. Accounts given by the twins changed over time. According to later reporting, investigators confronted inconsistencies between their statements and the physical evidence. The case gained national attention as police publicly identified the teenage twins as suspects in their mother's killing. On May 21, 2010, both Jasmiyah and Tasmiyah Whitehead were arrested and charged with murder. Because of their ages, the case raised immediate questions about juvenile defendants facing adult charges. Prosecutors alleged that the twins had jointly attacked their mother inside the home using a knife and physical force. As the case moved through the court system, additional details emerged about the family dynamic. Reporting at the time noted that Nikki Whitehead had contacted police multiple times in the days before her death due to concerns about her daughter's behavior. Those prior calls became part of the broader context considered by investigators, though they did not on their own establish what happened during the killing. The prosecution initially pursued charges of malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. The twins were held separately as the case progressed. Over the next several years, pre-trial motions, evaluations, and legal maneuvering delayed a trial. At one point, prosecutors sought to try the sisters separately. Rather than proceeding to trial, the case was ultimately resolved through plea agreements. On January 9, 2014, Tasmia Whitehead appeared before Rockdale County Superior Court Judge David Irwin and pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, falsification in government matters, and possession of a knife during the commission of a crime. The court imposed consecutive sentences totaling 30 years in prison, consisting of 20 years for voluntary manslaughter, 5 years for falsification, and 5 years for the weapon charge. Less than a month later, on February 7, 2014, Tasmia Whitehead entered a similar guilty plea. She pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and related charges, and was also sentenced by Judge Irwin to 30 years in prison, with credit for time already served. During the plea hearings, the court accepted that the voluntary manslaughter convictions reflected a resolution short of a murder verdict, while still holding both defendants criminally responsible for their mother's death. The plea agreements brought an end to a case that had stretched across nearly 4 years and drawn intense public scrutiny because of the defendants' ages and their relationship to the victim. Today, both Tasmia and Tasmia Whitehead remain incarcerated in the Georgia State Prison System, serving their 30-year sentences for voluntary manslaughter and related offenses. Number 7. Jared and Gerald Smith. In the early morning hours of June 30th, 2014, Tennille Alexander was walking alone through the Tower District of Fresno, California. It was approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, and the streets near the intersection of Belmont Avenue and Calaveras Street were nearly empty. Alexander, a 35-year-old woman working as a sex worker in the area, encountered 2 young men who cut her off on the sidewalk. They were 18-year-old identical twin brothers, Gerald and Jared Smith. The twins demanded money from her. Alexander refused and told them not to do this, adding that she was a girl and could see what was coming. She later testified that she could see rage in one of the twins' eyes, specifically identifying Jared as the one who appeared most aggressive. What happened next would set in motion a sequence of events that left one man dead and exposed the brutal capacity for violence in 2 teenagers who had just reached adulthood. According to Alexander's testimony, one of the Smith twins attacked her first. She said the other twin initially tried to stop his brother, but within moments, both were assaulting her. She described being hit with blows and kicked repeatedly by both young men. During the attack, she lost a tooth and sustained injuries to her neck and jaw that would cause her pain for months afterward. Alexander later told investigators that she believed she was going to die that morning. She had pleaded with the twins, telling them she was a woman and asking them not to hurt her, but her words had no effect. The attack continued with increasing intensity. At some point during the assault, both twins were fully engaged in beating her. The violence was captured on a city surveillance camera positioned to monitor the area, though the images were not perfectly clear due to the distance and lighting conditions at that hour. Nathan Halstead was 49 years old and riding his bicycle through the area when he came upon the scene. Halstead, described by those who knew him as a good person who looked out for others, stopped and asked the Smith twins what they were doing to Alexander. The moment he spoke, the twins redirected their attention away from Alexander and toward Halstead. What followed was a sustained and brutal beating that lasted approximately 5 minutes. The surveillance footage showed Halstead being punched, kicked, and stomped on by both twins. He fell to the ground, and the assault continued. The twins struck him repeatedly in the head and body. Witnesses and investigators later described the attack as relentless. Halstead was rendered unconscious and left lying in the middle of Belmont Avenue, a dimly lit roadway at that hour. While Halstead lay unconscious in the street, a white car approached the scene. The driver saw what was happening and tried to intervene. The Smith twins turned on this driver as well, attacking him and banging on his vehicle. During this encounter, one of the twins left fingerprints on the hood of the car. This physical evidence would later prove crucial in identifying the perpetrators. After attacking the driver, the twins fled the scene on foot, leaving Nathan Halstead motionless in the middle of the road. His bicycle was also in the lane, creating an additional hazard for approaching vehicles. Within minutes, a second car came down Belmont Avenue. The driver swerved to avoid hitting Halstead's bicycle, but was unable to see the unconscious man lying in the dark roadway. The vehicle struck Halstead. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Fresno police responded to the incident and immediately began processing the scene. They recovered surveillance video from the city camera that had captured the attack. The footage showed 2 young men assaulting the woman and then turning on the bicyclist. The video also showed the twins attacking the driver of the white car before fleeing. Investigators interviewed Tennille Alexander, who provided a detailed account of what had happened. She told police about the demand for money, the initial attack, and Nathan Halstead's intervention. She described the twins' appearance and behavior, noting that one was taller than the other and that she had seen rage in their eyes. The driver of the white car was also interviewed. He told investigators that the twins had attacked him when he tried to help. Critically, he had noticed one of the attackers touch his vehicle. Crime scene investigators processed the car and successfully lifted fingerprints from the hood. The fingerprints were run through the police database and came back with a match. The prints belonged to Gerald Smith, an 18-year-old resident of Fresno. The fact that his fingerprints were already in the system indicated he had prior contact with law enforcement, though the specific nature of his criminal history was not fully detailed in public records. Investigators learned that Gerald had an identical twin brother named Jared. On July 2nd, 2014, just 2 days after the attack, Fresno police held a press conference. Police Chief Jerry Dyer publicly released portions of the surveillance footage and announced that the department had identified suspects in the case. Dyer described the twins' behavior as predatory, stating that they acted like animals pursuing prey and that if one person walked by, they went after them. He emphasized that the driver who struck Nathan Halstead was not at fault, explaining that the driver had been on his way to work and was despondent after realizing he had hit someone. Dyer made it clear that the people responsible for Nathan Halstead's death were Gerald and Jared Smith, who had beaten him unconscious and left him in the roadway. Officers arrested both twins at their family home on July 3, 2014. During interrogation, both Gerald and Jared Smith confessed to their involvement in the attacks. They were charged with murder and multiple counts of assault. The murder charge was based on California's felony murder rule, which holds that if someone dies during the commission of a felony such as aggravated assault, the perpetrators can be charged with murder even if they did not directly cause the death. In this case, the twins had committed a violent assault that left the victim in a position where he was killed by a passing vehicle. On May 14, 2015, a preliminary hearing was held. Tennille Alexander testified publicly for the first time about what had happened that morning. She recounted the demand for money, the attack, and how Nathan Halstead had rolled up on his bicycle and asked what the twins were doing to her. She described how they immediately turned on him and beat him until he could no longer get up from the street. Alexander told the court that if Halstead had not intervened, she believed she would have been in his position. She credited him with saving her life. During the hearing, surveillance video was shown to the court. Prosecutors also presented evidence about the fingerprints lifted from the white car and the confessions obtained from both twins. Defense attorneys representing Gerald and Jared Smith argued that the twins did not believe they had committed murder, given that they had not physically run over Nathan Halstead themselves. The judge, however, found that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. The twins' mother, Lou Ann Smith, became a vocal defender of her sons throughout the legal proceedings. She told local news outlets that her boys had been jumped and were defending themselves against grown men, not attacking innocent people. She insisted that Gerald and Jared had just turned 18 and had dreams they were working hard for. Lou Ann Smith also argued that the driver who ran over Nathan Halstead should be the one facing murder charges, not her sons. She pointed out that her boys did not run over the victim and questioned why the driver was not being held accountable. These claims stood in direct contradiction to the evidence. The surveillance footage clearly showed the twins as the aggressors. The specific final charges are not fully detailed in available public records, and sources differ on whether the twins were ultimately convicted of murder or lesser offenses. What is confirmed is that on February 6th and 7th, 2019, nearly 5 years after the attack, both Gerald and Jared Smith were sentenced. Each twin received 12 years in California State Prison. Given that they had been in custody since July 2014, they were credited with time already served. Based on standard calculations for good behavior and time credits, their earliest possible release was projected for 2026. At the sentencing hearing, their mother continued to maintain that her sons were not murderers. She told reporters that when Gerald and Jared came home on the morning of the attack, they were wearing white t-shirts that had no blood on them, suggesting they could not have been involved in a violent assault. The Smith twins are currently incarcerated in California state prisons, serving out their 12-year sentences. With time served since 2014 and potential credits for good behavior, they may be released around 2026, though exact release dates depend on institutional behavior and parole board decisions. Number 8. Athif and Altaf Hussein. On the afternoon of September 29, 2023, a fight broke out among teenagers in Runfold Avenue, a residential street in Luton, Bedfordshire. It was a Friday, school had just let out, and the altercation involved two groups of young people who had some kind of ongoing dispute. The fight lasted only a few minutes. Punches were thrown, and at least one person was injured. Among those hurt was a 16-year-old named Athif Hussein. The fight ended, the teenagers dispersed, and by 3:45 in the afternoon, it appeared to be over. But it was not over. What happened next would transform a common schoolyard brawl into a murder investigation. Athif Hussein had a twin brother named Altaf. The two were identical, 16 years old, and both lived in Luton. After the fight in Runfold Avenue, the dispute did not cool down. Instead, it escalated. Videos of the fight began circulating on social media, and, over the next few hours, the fight that had ended in Runfold Avenue reignited online. And somewhere in that window of time, between the afternoon fight and the early evening, a decision was made by multiple teenagers to meet again, and this time, some of them would bring knives. By 7 o'clock that evening, two groups of teenagers had gathered in a pub car park near Nunnery Lane in Luton. There were enough individuals involved that police would later classify the incident as violent disorder. Among the group that included Athif and Altaf Hussein, several were armed. Athif had a knife strapped to his leg, concealed beneath two pairs of jogging pants. He had admitted to authorities after his arrest that he had previously tried to buy a so-called zombie knife, a large decorative blade popular among some young people in the UK and later banned by the government in 2024. Also present in the car park that evening was a 16-year-old boy named Ashraf Habimana. Ashraf was a student at Luton's Sixth Form College. He had been born in Bradford but had spent most of his life in Luton. On the evening of September 29th, Ashraf was with friends. He had not been involved in the fight earlier that afternoon in Runfold Avenue. He had no active part in the dispute between the two groups, but he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The confrontation in the car park turned violent almost immediately. CCTV cameras in the area captured what happened next. The footage would later become the central piece of evidence in the murder trial. It showed Altaf Hussein approaching Ashraf Habimana and punching him. Ashraf, who was unarmed, tried to get away. He was not part of the fight. He was not armed. He was attempting to flee. But Athif Hussein came at him with the knife. The CCTV showed Athif stabbing Ashraf 3 times in the back. Ashraf fell to the ground. Altaf then kicked him while he was down. The attack lasted only seconds, but the damage was catastrophic. The CCTV also captured Athif stabbing another 16-year-old boy during the melee. That boy survived, but he was left with life-threatening injuries. The Hussein twins fled the scene. Emergency services were called. Ashraf Habimana was rushed to the hospital, but he died a short time later. He was 16 years old. Bedfordshire police launched a murder investigation immediately. Over the following days and weeks, police made multiple arrests. Initially, 5 people were arrested on suspicion of murder and later released on bail. On Wednesday, October 4th, 2 teenage boys were rearrested. The investigation was extensive. Officers reviewed CCTV footage from multiple cameras in the area, collected witness statements from those who had been present, and traced the social media activity that had escalated the afternoon fight into an armed confrontation. On October 5th, 2 teenagers were charged with murder, attempted murder, and violent disorder. Because they were minors at the time, their names were not released to the public. They appeared at Luton Magistrates Court on October 6th via video link and were remanded in custody. Over the following months, additional arrests were made. Eventually, 7 people in total were charged in connection with the violent disorder and Ashraf's death. Among them were Athif and Altaf Hussein, whose identities remained protected under UK law due to their age. A plea hearing was scheduled for January 5th, 2024. When the hearing took place, both Athif and Altaf Hussein entered pleas of not guilty to all charges. The trial of Athif and Altaf Hussein began in March of 2024. The evidence presented by the prosecution was compelling. The CCTV footage was clear and unambiguous. It showed Altaf punching Ashraf, Athif stabbing him 3 times in the back, and Altaf kicking him while he was on the ground. The jury deliberated and returned with verdicts. Athif Hussein was unanimously found guilty of murder. He was also convicted of attempted murder for stabbing the second 16-year-old boy, violent disorder, and possession of a bladed article. Altaf Hussein was found guilty of manslaughter and violent disorder. The distinction in the verdicts reflected the jury's assessment of each brother's role in Ashraf's death. Athif had wielded the knife and delivered the fatal wounds. Altaf had assaulted Ashraf and kicked him while he was down, contributing to the circumstances that led to his death, but he had not stabbed him. Under UK law, that distinction mattered, and Altaf was convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter rather than murder. On October 15, 2024, Athif and Altaf Hussein, now 18 years old, appeared at Luton Crown Court for sentencing. The judge sentenced Athif Hussein to life in prison with a minimum term of 24 years. He sentenced Altaf Hussein to 7 years in prison. Athif and Altaf Hussein are now serving their sentences in the UK prison system. Athif will be in his 40s before he is eligible for release. Altaf will be in his mid-20s. The boy Athif stabbed and who survived the attack will carry the physical and emotional scars of that night for the rest of his life. Number 9. Dante and Dante Hall. On the evening of September 8, 2006, 18-year-old Angel Glenn received a phone call about a job. She worked as a stripper, performing at private parties around the Orlando area on weekends, and this particular gig was in Eustis, a small city in Lake County, Florida, about 40 miles northwest of Orlando. A man named Willie Shelton, who went by the nickname Jay, had hired her and 2 other dancers to perform at a house party. Glenn was told she would make good money that night. What she did not tell Shelton was that she had a boyfriend who was very interested in who would be at that party and what they might have. Angel Glenn's boyfriend was 22-year-old Dante Jermaine Hall. Dante lived with his mother in Orlando, had no job, and no car. He relied on Glenn or friends to drive him around. When Glenn told him about the party in Eustis, Dante saw an opportunity. He told her he planned to rob the people who would be there. This was not the first time he had suggested such a plan. According to Glenn's later testimony, whenever she was about to go somewhere for work, Dante would say something like, "Oh, yeah, we're going to rob them dudes." This time, he meant it. Dante Hall had an identical twin brother named Dante James Hall. The two had grown up together in the Pine Hills area of Orlando, a neighborhood where poverty, drugs, and crime were constants. Their father had spent more time in prison than out, according to testimony later presented in court. Both parents had used and sold drugs. A mitigation specialist who investigated the twins' background for Dante's trial described their upbringing as a multi-generational cycle of dysfunction, saying that drugs and crime were as normal in their household as mowing the lawn or going to church would be for other families. The twins had struggled in school with truancy and behavioral problems. As adults, both had been involved in street-level drug dealing. Dante had a prior violent felony conviction and had been accused of a separate street killing in Orange County, though the outcome of that case is unclear from available records. The twins were sometimes hard to tell apart, though Dante had distinguishing features: a row of gold-capped teeth on the bottom and a neck tattoo that read, "Money ain't a thang." Both brothers went by the nickname Twin, though Dante was also called Maine, and Dante was known as James. On September 8th, Dante assembled a crew. In addition to his twin brother Dante, he brought in 2 other men known by the street names Shoo Shoo and Pig. Angel Glenn recruited 2 additional dancers, Nikita Jackson and a woman named Brittany, and the 3 women drove together from Orlando to Eustis. The rest of the group followed in a rental car that belonged to Dante. The plan was straightforward. Angel would go into the party, assess the situation, and relay information back to Dante by cell phone. Then the men would come in, rob everyone, and leave. The house party was at 940 Gotchi Avenue in Eustis. When the women arrived, several men were inside, drinking alcohol, smoking marijuana, and using ecstasy. Meanwhile, Angel Glenn stayed in contact with Dante Hall via her cell phone. She told him how many men were in the house, whether there were any guns visible, and what valuables she could see. There was discussion among the conspirators about a possible stash of money or drugs somewhere in the house. Music started playing, and the women began their performance. They had been dancing for about 5 to 10 minutes when the front door opened. Dante Hall entered the house first. He was carrying an AK-47 assault rifle. As he walked in, he said, "I'm going to make this choppa dance." Behind him came Dante, Shushu, and Pig. All 4 men wore dark clothing and had their faces partially covered with ski masks. Dante, the most vocal and aggressive of the group, began shouting orders. He demanded money, drugs, and jewelry. The other 3 men fanned out, pointing guns at the people in the house. The party guests, who moments earlier had been drinking and enjoying the performance, were now face down on the floor or sitting frozen on couches, trying to comply with the demands being shouted at them. The robbery did not go as Dante had planned. The men at the party were not carrying large amounts of cash. They did not have the stash of drugs or money that had been rumored. Dante became impatient. According to witness testimony, he grew angry because the victims were either slow to hand over what they had or simply did not have enough to satisfy him. Then he opened fire. Dante shot out the lights. The 3 dancers ran to the back room. One of them, still wearing 10-inch heels and barely dressed, dropped to the floor and began reciting Psalm 23 as bullets flew. The men in the house scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to go. 4 men were shot. Anthony Bernard Blunt, 35 years old, from Mount Dora, was hit multiple times. Keeson Evans, 32, from Tavares, was shot in the face. Willie Shelton, the man who had hired the dancers, was struck by bullets in his chest, abdomen, and extremities. A 4th man, Joshua Daniel, also sustained multiple gunshot wounds. The gunfire lasted only minutes, but the damage was catastrophic. When the shooting stopped, the gunmen fled. The women in the back room, shaking and terrified, helped each other get dressed. Angel Glenn was vomiting from shock. One of the victims, lying on the floor, was trying to speak, but blood poured from his mouth. Another was moving, shaking, crying out in pain. Anthony Blunt had been shot several times, but he was still conscious. According to testimony from a Eustis police officer who arrived on the scene, Blunt was shaking, moving around, and crying, "I don't want to die." He remained in excruciating agony for approximately 30 minutes before he lapsed into a coma. He died from his injuries. Keeson Evans, shot in the face, also died. Willie Shelton and Joshua Daniel survived, but their injuries were severe. Shelton spent 2 years in the hospital recovering, and doctors later testified that his survival was miraculous, given the extent of the damage to his body. The 3 dancers left the house together, with Angel Glenn driving. She was terrified, shaking, barely able to function. As they drove back toward Orlando, Dante Hall called her cell phone. He asked if the women were okay and told them to calm down. He and Glenn arranged to meet at a gas station on a major road between Eustis and Orlando. When they arrived, Dante got out of Dante's rental car and into Angel's vehicle. He was carrying a gun and a bag of stolen property, including jewelry taken from the victims. During the ride, Dante told Angel he was angry. He said he did not get enough money and the robbery had not gone the way he had planned. Glenn dropped Dante off at his mother's house, where he was living at the time. The next morning, Angel Glenn returned to Dante's mother's house at his request. When she arrived, Dante Hall and the twins' mother were also there. Dante was pulling jewelry from the robbery out of a Gucci bag. The twins sat together and discussed what they would do with the stolen items, how much the jewelry was worth, and how they could turn it into cash. Over the following days, the plan to dispose of the evidence moved forward. Dante went to a hotel where Dante was staying with Angel and her 1-year-old son, and the brothers discussed the logistics of pawning the jewelry. They left the hotel together with most of the stolen goods. Dante gave Angel a few pieces to pawn on her own. She took them to a pawn shop, received $1,000, and gave the money to Dante. The twins used multiple pawn shops to sell the jewelry, and Dante made phone calls to Shushu and Pig to discuss how the proceeds from the robbery would be divided. The jewelry had already been melted down by the time investigators began tracing it. Law enforcement began working the case immediately. Investigators from the Eustis Police Department and the Lake County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene at Gotchi Avenue and found 2 men dead, 2 critically wounded, and 3 traumatized women who had witnessed the entire event. One of the dancers, Nikita Jackson, spoke to police and provided crucial information. She told them what had happened and gave them Angel Glenn's name. Detectives tracked down Glenn in Orlando on September 14th and obtained her cell phone. They examined hundreds of call records and text messages, which revealed the communication between Glenn and Dante Hall before, during, and after the robbery. Angel Glenn was arrested for pawning stolen jewelry. She spent several weeks in jail and initially lied to investigators because she was frightened for her family's safety. But as the evidence mounted and other witnesses came forward, Glenn eventually admitted what had happened. She agreed to cooperate with authorities and testify against Dante Hall and his twin brother Dante. In exchange, she was granted limited immunity from capital murder charges and would face only conspiracy to commit armed robbery, which carried a maximum sentence of 15 years, but could have been prosecuted as a life or death penalty case if she had been treated like the twins. Her testimony, which was later verified by polygraph, became the foundation of the prosecution's case. Dante Germain Hall was indicted first. His trial began in April of 2009. Angel Glenn testified that Dante had told her in advance that he planned to rob the men at the party, that he had followed her to Eustis, and that he was the first gunman to enter the house carrying the AK-47. Nikita Jackson, the other dancer, testified that Dante was the man demanding money and jewelry, that he was carrying a large gun, and that he was the first to fire his weapon. Willie Shelton, one of the survivors, testified that the man with the AK-47 was the one giving orders to the other robbers. The cell phone records corroborated the timeline. The jury deliberated for only 90 minutes before finding Dante Hall guilty on all charges. The penalty phase of Dante's trial focused on whether he should receive life in prison or the death penalty. The prosecution presented evidence of 3 aggravating circumstances. Dante had a prior violent felony conviction, he had knowingly created a great risk of death to many people, and the murders were committed for financial gain. The jury voted unanimously that all 3 factors had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution also argued that the crime met the standard for heinous, atrocious, or cruel, and the jury agreed by a vote of 11-1. The jury recommended the death penalty for the murder of Anthony Blunt by a vote of 8-4. For the murder of Keeson Evans, Dante received a sentence of life in prison. Circuit Judge Michael Johnson accepted the jury's recommendation and formally sentenced Dante Hall to death on April 22, 2009. Dante James Hall's case was far more complicated. He faced the same charges as his brother, and prosecutors argued that both twins were equally responsible for the robbery and murders. But Dante's trial became a legal marathon. The first trial, which began in September of 2008, ended in a mistrial. A second trial in 2009 also ended in a mistrial. A third attempt in September of 2009 resulted in yet another mistrial. It was not until the fourth trial, in November of 2009, that a jury was able to reach a verdict. The delays were exhausting for the victims' families, who had attended every court proceeding over more than 3 years. The key issue in Dante's trial was the extent of his involvement. There was no question that he had been present at the robbery. Angel Glenn testified that both twins were there, and both were armed. Cell phone records placed Dante at the scene. Witnesses described seeing multiple armed men. The defense, led by Tavares attorneys Michael Graves and John Spivey, did not dispute that Dante participated in the crime. What they argued was that his level of culpability was significantly different from his brother's. Dante had not been the one carrying the AK-47. He had not been the one shouting orders or firing the first shots. Because only one gun was recovered by police, forensic experts could not determine with certainty who had fired which shots that killed the victims. The jury, after deliberating for a day and a half, found Dante Hall guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and the related charges. But when it came time to recommend a sentence, they made a distinction. They believed Dante had been present and armed, but they were not convinced he had fired the fatal shots. On November 27, 2009, the jury recommended a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole rather than death. Angel Glenn's sentencing came in May of 2010. She had expected to receive probation for her cooperation with authorities. She had testified against both Hall brothers, and Assistant State Attorney Bill Gross, who prosecuted the case, acknowledged that her testimony had been essential in securing convictions. Gross described her as having transformed from a thug wannabe into a devoted single mother. Defense attorney Eric Barker presented evidence of Glenn's rehabilitation, including letters from her employer at a Georgia coffee house where she had been promoted to manager. But Judge Johnson was not swayed. He acknowledged that Glenn had changed and that she had cooperated with the investigation, but he said he could not ignore the role she had played in setting the crime in motion. He pointed out that while Glenn may not have known in advance that people would be shot, she knew the men were not going to show up with toy guns, so she had to have known there was potential for violence. He was also troubled by her actions after the shooting. She had driven her boyfriend around Orlando, spent the night in a hotel with him, helped him pawn the stolen jewelry, and lied to police, all while knowing that Dante and his brother were killers. The judge sentenced Angel Glenn to 10 years in prison. Glenn was stunned. She had brought her 4-year-old son to court, expecting to go home. When the sentence was announced, she repeated incredulously, 10 years? He sentenced me to 10 years. The legal saga of Dante Hall did not end with his death sentence. His case was automatically appealed to the Florida Supreme Court, as is standard procedure for all death penalty convictions in the state. In 2012, the Florida Supreme Court affirmed both his conviction and his death sentence. Dante remained on death row. But in 2016, the legal landscape in Florida changed. The Florida Supreme Court ruled that juries must unanimously recommend a death sentence for it to be imposed. The state legislature amended the law in March of that year to comply with the ruling. The court also determined that death sentences finalized after June of 2002 could be appealed on the grounds that they had not received unanimous jury recommendations. Dante Hall's death sentence had been recommended by a vote of 8-4, which meant it did not meet the new standard. In June of 2017, the Florida Supreme Court vacated Dante Hall's death sentence and remanded his case back to the trial court for a new penalty phase. Dante, now 32 years old, would have another chance to argue for his life. Finally, on November 12, 2024, the legal process reached its conclusion. The state of Florida agreed to drop the death penalty. Dante Jermaine Hall was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life incarcerated, just like his twin brother Dante. The Hall twins, who had grown up together in a household defined by drugs, crime, and incarceration, would grow old together in the Florida prison system, separated by walls but linked by the same irreversible choices they had made on the night of September 9, 2006. The two accomplices, known only as Shushu and Pig, were identified by police as suspects in the robbery and murders, but they were never charged. Assistant State Attorney Bill Gross told the victims' families at one point, "We haven't given up on the last two, but no charges were ever filed, and the two men remain unidentified and unprosecuted to this day." Number 10. Robert and Stephen Spahalski. In November 2005, a middle-aged man walked into the Monroe County Public Safety Building in Rochester, New York, and told authorities he had just killed someone. The man was Robert Spahalski. His statement was not vague or hypothetical. According to court records, he described a killing that had just occurred inside his own home. That confession immediately shifted a routine police response into a homicide investigation, and it would soon reopen questions about 3 other deaths that had gone unsolved for more than a decade. Investigators responding to Robert Spahalski's statement located the body of a woman inside his residence. The death became the 4th homicide tied to him, but it was the first time law enforcement had a suspect who came forward voluntarily. Detectives began formal interviews, and during those interviews, Robert Spahalski confessed to 3 earlier killings, dating back to the early 1990s. Those admissions prompted police to revisit cold cases from Rochester and nearby Webster, New York. The first of those earlier killings occurred in December 1990 in Rochester, near the Lake Avenue area. The second followed in July 1991, near Emerson Street. A third victim, Charles Grande, was killed in October 1991 in the town of Webster. Each case had remained unresolved at the time, with limited physical evidence and no arrests. According to later court decisions, investigators re-examined witness statements, photo arrays, and earlier investigative steps as they worked to corroborate Robert Spahalski's confessions. By December 12, 2006, Robert Spahalski was convicted by a jury in Monroe County of 5 counts of second-degree murder, reflecting the 4 killings and the legal structure of the charges under New York law. Sentencing followed, and reporting consistently describes the punishment as the equivalent of 100 years in prison, imposed through consecutive maximum terms. In June 2017, the Appellate Division of the New York Supreme Court affirmed the convictions, concluding that the verdicts were supported by the evidence and that the sentence was not unduly harsh or excessive. As Robert Spahalski's case moved through the courts, attention returned to his family history, particularly to his identical twin brother, Stephen Spahalski. Decades earlier, Stephen Spahalski had been convicted in a separate homicide case. In 1971, in Elmira Heights, New York, a man named Ronald Ripley was killed. Stephen Spahalski, described in multiple mainstream summaries as a teenager at the time, was charged in connection with that death. Public reporting states that Stephen pleaded guilty to manslaughter. While open court documents from that era are limited, widely cited accounts agree that he spent decades incarcerated following that conviction. Precise sentencing calculations and later custody details vary by source, and some aspects of his post-conviction history are not fully documented in publicly accessible court records. Today, Robert Spahalski remains incarcerated in New York State Prison, serving consecutive sentences for multiple second-degree murder convictions. Stephen Spahalski's manslaughter conviction, though far older, remains part of the public record as one of the earliest violent crimes associated with the family. Together, their cases are cited not because of collaboration, but because of the stark coincidence of 2 identical twins in different decades and different circumstances, each convicted of killing, with their lives ultimately defined by separate paths that led to the same outcome: permanent placement in the criminal justice system. And that's all we have for you today. Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe for more incredible true crime series every week.